These gray trees don't look like a lot right now, but these are olive trees. This is an olive orchard in the Italian peninsula. Like Greece and most of the entire peninsula of Italy, these scrubby little trees were the cash crop. In addition to wine and the vineyards, these scrubby little trees provided olive oil, which was the most important cooking ingredient for the food in the area. Now, the Etruscans, long before the Romans, the Etruscans were harvesting olives and pressing them into olive oil. We have found ships in the Mediterranean, Etruscan ships, that had cargoes full of wine and olive oil. And so it continues to be an important cash crop for the Italian peninsula. But this orchard in particular is on the side of the hill, it's really steep here, it's on the side of the hill of the city of Assisi, which is in the Umbria region of the Italian peninsula. And Assisi is important for one particular individual, St. Francis of Assisi. He grew up here. And after he had a conversion episode when he was in his 20s, he decided to form a monastery. And so that's what he founded, the Monastery of Assisi, otherwise known as the Friary Sacro Convento. It was founded around 1230, soon after St. Francis's death. St. Francis was devoted first to protecting the Holy Land, but second and most importantly for his order was to help the poor. The Franciscans, monks, would take a vow, actually 3 vows, very important. They were vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Over time, the monastery would grow, but the most important aspect of it, there's a couple of basilicas in there, there's the tomb of Francis is inside, but you see these walls. They aren't to shut the monks in, they are to keep the enemies out, because this monastery was, number one, a place of pilgrimage, and as a place of pilgrimage for monasteries in general, it became quite wealthy. And number two, it was a place of knowledge. Franciscans and other monks in other monasteries were some of the few literate people of their areas, of their times. And so it's thanks to the friars here in the Franciscan monastery and other monasteries that books and manuscripts and codices were kept and copied and were not subject to the whims of time or being destroyed by vandals or incoming raiders. The monastery orders were different than the church orders. Priests had their own separate work inside the city walls with churches established by the bishop. Monasteries were different. Monasteries put a premium on order and discipline. And how do you encourage order and discipline? You separate your monastery from the secular world. This is exactly why you see these giant walls here. These are the walls of the monastery of St. Francis of Assisi. We are outside the city walls and of course set apart from this beautiful land of Perugia. If the monastery was truly closed off, that meant they had to be self-sufficient, meaning that they had to grow their own food, milk their own cows or goats, make cheese. We have records of them having a tannery on the grounds of a monastery or weaving their own cloth for their own robes. In other monasteries, the emphasis was not so much on self-sufficiency and contemplation, but of intellectual pursuits, rewriting manuscripts, keeping books in order, and making sure that pieces of art were kept safe. But one thing that would happen to all of these monasteries in general was the establishment of relics, which is one of the reasons why they had to build their walls. Relics, of course, are parts of bodies or things associated with saints. And having these particular relics turned monasteries into a pilgrimage. Pilgrims would come from all over the place, visit, and pay for things, leave money, maybe stay in the monastery in a separate section. And so monasteries became rich. You see the irony of this huge, beautiful monastery for Franciscans who take a vow of poverty. The church, the basilicas inside are sumptuous, full of silver candlesticks and paintings by some of the great fresco artists. Giotto is one of the gentlemen who did the paintings. They are also full of manuscripts, countless manuscripts that rival those anywhere in Europe. And these are the ancient handwritten books, codices, as they were. And so these monasteries each fulfilled different purposes depending on what order they were from. But in the main part, it's important to remember their job was not necessarily to perform church services, but to be set off from the people. The money in the monasteries didn't necessarily come from pilgrims buying souvenirs. One of the ways monasteries became very wealthy is that they had benefactors. The local lords of the manor or kings would donate money to the monasteries so that the monks, the friars, and even the nuns could say continuous prayer for the souls of the rich people or their family. And so this meant for a very strong tie between the monastery and the more important people of the location. And this was important. Many of the nunneries housed the widows of very rich men. They had nowhere else to go. And so they would come into nunneries and make their living there. But they would become very important go-betweens between the various lords of the manor, in that they would have diplomatic, they would make peace treaties, they'd help do this sort of thing. It was also very important that these people were also all literate. Nunneries were especially important for women. We might think now of nunneries being somewhat cruel, women being locked away. It was the exact opposite. A nunnery for a woman of this time was usually the only place she could learn to read and write, and she had autonomy over her own self. Remember, if you've got a self-reliant, self-sufficient nunnery, the nuns were away from the men. They had to make all the choices. They had to become the administration. They had to grow the food and understand how everything worked. One other important aspect of these monasteries, and another way they got rich, was that they themselves could have a large expanse of land, and the monastery themselves, mainly the head of the monastery, would be the lord of the manor. That the monastery might have peasants working all of these lands, growing food, and then of course the extra food would be sold to people in cities. And so the monasteries themselves, even though they were set apart, were very much part of the community, an important part of the economy. But they were really there as a way for an average person to show an immense amount of dedication to their faith. They were giving everything up to become monks, to become friars, to become nuns. And so it's the ultimate expression of faith for these people, what they could do. And in the case of St. Francis and the monks, the Franciscans, they would be out trying to help impoverished people. There's a sister nunnery just down the street called the Poor Clares, started by a friend of Francis, a contemporary of Francis. They devoted themselves to being a hospital. And even though the care, the medical care in the Middle Ages was lousy, it was something. And they did what they could, and they devoted themselves to this. So don't forget, when you think of the Middle Ages, the monks and the nuns play a huge role in what's going to happen all throughout the space.